The rain was a language in the Pacific Northwest, and Anya Sharma was slowly becoming a fluent speaker. It had 1,000 different voices, the soft, persistent hiss that was the sound of solitude, the sharp staccato against the metal roof of her cabin that spoke of coming storms, and the heavy, sighing whisper through the boughs of the Douglas firs that meant the world was washing itself clean. For 2 years, these woods had been her sanctuary, a cathedral of green and gray where the only demands were the splitting of wood and the tending of a fire. She had come here to forget the language of the desert, the hard-cracked consonants of gunfire and the guttural vowels of explosions that still echoed in the hollows of her memory. Here, the silence was broken only by the elements and the quiet presence of the one soul who understood her own silence. Ghost, her German shepherd, lay at her feet, a study in gray and white fur against the worn planks of the porch. His head rested on his paws, but his ears, twin satellites of vigilance, swiveled to track the scuttling of a squirrel, the distant call of a raven. He was a veteran, too, in his own way, a retired military working dog whose papers listed him as surplus, but whose heart was anything but. His original handler hadn't made it back, and in the sterile quiet of a VA adoption event, his haunted eyes had found hers. A recognition passed between them, a shared understanding of ghosts seen and battles fought in places no one else could comprehend. They were two fractured pieces of the same whole, glued together by a shared need for peace. Anya ran a hand over his broad head, her fingers tracing the faint scar above his eye. "Just rain, boy," she murmured, her voice rough from disuse. He responded with a low rumble in his chest, a sound of contentment that was the bedrock of her new life. The land was 40 acres of unforgiving, beautiful wilderness, bought with the last of her combat pay and a disability settlement she tried not to think about. It was her fortress, buffered by miles of logging roads and dense, unforgiving forest. The nearest town, Port Alastair, was a 30-minute drive of mud and gravel, a place of worn-out fishing boats and people with faces as weathered as the coastline. She went there only when necessary, for supplies she couldn't grow or hunt. Her contact with the human world was a transaction, brief and guarded. The quiet rhythm of their existence was a fragile truce she had negotiated with the world, and she guarded it fiercely. This morning, however, the rain spoke a different dialect. There was a tension in it, a fretfulness that mirrored the unease coiling in her own gut. Ghost felt it too. He had been restless since dawn, pacing the perimeter of the small clearing around the cabin, his usual calm replaced by a low, whining anxiety. He would stop, nose to the wind, a statue of tense muscle, before resuming his agitated patrol. Anya had learned to trust the dog's intuition as implicitly as she trusted her own training. Ghost was her early warning system, a barometer for threats she couldn't yet see or hear. She stood up, her joints protesting the damp chill. The scent of pine and wet earth was thick, a familiar comfort that did little to soothe her now. She scanned the tree line, her eyes moving in the practiced, methodical way she'd been taught, near to far, left to right. Nothing, just the endless, shifting curtain of green and the mist that clung to the hills like a shroud. The world she had built was predicated on a simple, sacred rule: nothing from the outside gets in. No unexpected visitors, no stray hikers, no government officials checking on the reclusive veteran. For 2 years, the rule had held, but the dog's unease and the strange tenor of the rain suggested the truce was about to be broken. It was Ghost who gave the first concrete signal. He stopped his pacing near the northern edge of her property, a place where the forest floor was a thick carpet of moss and ferns, and the ancient trees grew so close together they blotted out the sky. He lowered his head, a deep growl vibrating from his chest, a sound she hadn't heard since their first few months together, when the phantom crack of a car backfiring would send him into a defensive crouch. She moved toward him, her worn leather boots making no sound on the damp ground. "What is it, Ghost? What do you hear?" she asked, her hand resting on the reassuring warmth of his back. He didn't look at her, his entire being focused on a patch of earth a few yards away. It looked no different from the surrounding terrain, a gentle slope covered in sword ferns and decaying leaves. But as she drew closer, she felt it, a subtle vibration through the soles of her boots. It was a low, rhythmic hum, so deep it was almost subaudial, more a feeling than a sound. It was the kind of hum that spoke of powerful machinery, of generators and ventilation systems. It was the sound of industry, of something hidden and alive, deep beneath the forest floor. It was the sound of the outside world, and it was on her land. The fragile peace of her sanctuary shattered, not with a bang, but with a low, persistent hum that promised a war she thought she had left behind. Her hand tightened on Ghost's fur, her knuckles white. The ghosts of the desert were supposed to stay there. But the hum beneath her feet felt like a new one, stirring from a long sleep, and she knew, with the cold certainty of a soldier who has just walked into an ambush, that her life, the quiet, simple life she had fought so desperately to build, was about to change forever. For those who value the bonds of loyalty and the fight for what is right, we invite you to follow our channel, where stories of quiet courage unfold. The hum was an anchor, pulling her down into a state of hypervigilance she hadn't inhabited so fully since the Kringle. Every nerve ending fizzed with awareness. Her breathing became shallow, controlled. The forest, her sanctuary, transformed before her eyes into a tactical landscape. Every tree was cover, every shadow a potential concealment. The gentle slope where Ghost stood sentinel was now a suspected enemy position. She knelt beside him, placing a palm flat against the damp earth. The vibration was stronger here, a steady, thrumming pulse that seemed to sync with the frantic beat of her own heart. It was deep, too deep for a simple septic system or a private well. It was the signature of something significant, something engineered and powerful, buried with deliberate intent. Ghost whined again, a high note of distress, and nudged her hand with his wet nose. His message clear: wrong. This is wrong. Anya's mind, a machine honed by years of threat assessment, began to work the problem. Anomaly. Unidentified subterranean energy source on secured property. Initial hypothesis: clandestine infrastructure. She rose slowly, her movements fluid and silent, and began a systematic search of the area. She didn't look for a door or a handle. You don't hide something this substantial and leave an obvious point of entry. You hide it in plain sight. You use nature as your accomplice. She looked for what was out of place. A patch of vegetation that was too uniform. A drainage pattern that defied the natural contour of the land. A line in the landscape that was just a little too straight. For an hour, she quartered the area in an expanding box search, Ghost moving at her heel, a silent gray shadow. The rain had softened to a mist, clinging to her jacket and beating on the dog's fur. The hum remained constant, a maddening, invisible presence. Then she found it, not with her eyes, but with her feet. A section of ground, roughly 10 feet square, that felt different. The moss under her boot was real, the dirt was real, but the ground beneath it had none of the subtle give of the surrounding forest floor. It was rigid, unyielding. She scraped away a patch of moss and soil with the heel of her boot. Her fingers, numb with cold, probed the exposed surface. It was concrete, but a strange composite, textured and colored to mimic the bedrock of the region. A masterful deception. But what sealed it was the seam. A hairline fracture, almost invisible, tracing a perfect rectangle. It was too precise for geology. It was the work of a human hand. A very, very skilled human hand. A memory flared, hot and dusty. A village in Paktika province, the search for a hidden weapons cache. The target was a compound, mud walls and dirt floors. They had searched for hours, finding nothing. Then, her sergeant, a man named Davis with eyes that missed nothing, had pointed to a corner of a room. The dust, he'd said. It settled wrong, a perfectly straight line in the fine layer of dust on the floor. Beneath it, a trapdoor leading to a tunnel packed with RPGs and ammunition. The details change, she thought, but the fundamentals of concealment are universal. She stood up, her gaze sweeping the surrounding trees. Was she being watched? The feeling prickled at the back of her neck, the familiar sixth sense of being in someone's sights. She saw nothing, heard nothing but the drip of water from the leaves and the subterranean hum. But the absence of evidence wasn't evidence of absence. She placed 2 fingers on Ghost's neck, a silent command. He immediately sank to the ground, belly down, his body still and observant, a living, breathing motion sensor. Anya returned to her cabin, her mind a whirlwind of calculations. This wasn't some forgotten Cold War relic. The composite material, the precision of the construction, the powerful hum, it was all modern, high-tech, and active. The question wasn't just what it was, but who had built it on her land. Had they known she was here? Or did they assume this isolated patch of wilderness was uninhabited? The implications were unsettling. Her fortress had a secret door, and someone else had the key. Back in the cabin, the warmth of the wood stove did little to chase the chill from her bones. She pulled out an old steel footlocker from under her bed, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, beneath neatly folded wool blankets, was the other Anya, the one she had tried to bury. She lifted out a set of tools, not for carpentry, but for deconstruction. A Halligan bar, a small pry bar, a set of lock picks she hadn't touched in years, and a compact, powerful headlamp. She didn't consider calling the sheriff. What would she say? There's a strange humming on my property. They would think she was another crazy, paranoid vet. No, this was her land. Her problem. She had to know what she was dealing with. This was a reconnaissance mission. Gather intelligence, assess the threat, then decide on a course of action. As dusk began to bleed through the trees, painting the forest in shades of indigo and charcoal, she moved back toward the site. The hum seemed louder in the fading light, a dissonant heartbeat in the quiet woods. She strapped the headlamp to her forehead, but left it off. She would work by the ambient light of the moon as long as she could. Ghost was still where she had left him, a patient, silent guardian. She gave him a soft murmur of praise and set to work. The seam was the key. She used the thin edge of the pry bar, gently, patiently, clearing the dirt and debris from the hairline crack. It was a slow, painstaking process. Her fingers, though cold, were steady. Her focus narrowed to the task at hand, the outside world falling away. This, she knew, the patient, methodical dismantling of an obstacle. Breaching. After 20 minutes of careful work, she had cleared one edge of the rectangle. There was no lock, no handle. It was sealed. Magnetically, she suspected, or with some kind of hydraulic system. Brute force was an option, but an unwise one. It would be loud and would announce her presence to anyone who might be listening. She needed leverage. She found a small gap at one corner, a tiny imperfection in the seal, and wedged the forked end of the Halligan bar into it. She put her weight on the bar, a steady, controlled pressure. For a moment, nothing happened. The slab was immovable. She repositioned, found a better angle, and tried again. Sweat trickled down her temples, mingling with the rain. Then, a faint click, and a sigh of displaced air. The magnetic seal had broken. A corner of the massive slab lifted by a fraction of an inch. It was enough. Working quickly now, she used the pry bar to increase the gap, then switched back to the Halligan, using it to lever the entire slab upwards. It was immensely heavy, counterweight by a sophisticated hydraulic system that now worked with her instead of against her. The slab rose silently, a dark rectangle opening in the forest floor, revealing a deeper darkness below. A rush of cool, sterile air washed over her, carrying a faint, antiseptic scent. It smelled of ozone, circulated air, and something else. A sharp, chemical tang that reminded her of industrial solvents. She flicked on her headlamp. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a steel ladder descending into a square shaft. The walls were smooth, polished concrete. Wires and conduits ran down one side in neat, organized bundles. This was no rustic bunker. This was the entrance to a state-of-the-art subterranean facility. She looked at Ghost. He stood at the edge of the opening, peering into the blackness, a low growl rumbling in his throat. He did not want to go down there. "Stay," she commanded softly. "Watch," he understood. He was her rear guard, her overwatch. Taking a deep breath of the clean, wet forest air, Anya Sharma slung the pry bar over her shoulder, gripped the cold steel of the ladder, and descended into the humming darkness that had invaded her world. The descent felt like a journey into the Earth's mechanical heart. The air grew colder, the hum grew louder, vibrating through the rungs of the ladder and up into her arms. The beam of her headlamp sliced a cone of white light through the absolute black, revealing the sheer, featureless walls of the shaft. It was a 20-foot drop to a grated steel platform. As her boots touched down with a soft clang, motion-activated lights flickered on overhead. They weren't harsh fluorescent tubes, but soft, recessed LEDs, casting an even, shadowless glow. The space was a small, square airlock. On the far side was a heavy steel door, the kind you'd see on a bank vault or a submarine. It was seamless, with no visible handle or keypad, just a small, dark retinal scanner next to it. She was locked out. Or so they thought. Anya was an engineer. She understood systems. And every system has a bypass. Her eyes traced the conduits running from the ceiling down the wall to a junction box next to the door. Power, data, control. It was all there. She didn't need to hack the scanner if she could convince the door it had received the correct signal. She set down her bar and pulled a small multi-tool from her pocket. The junction box cover was held on by standard hex bolts. An oversight. Or maybe they never imagined someone like her would get this far. Inside the box was a neat, color-coded array of wires. A familiar landscape. She studied the configuration, her mind cross-referencing it with schematics she hadn't thought about in years. The retinal scanner would send a specific encrypted signal to a processor, which would then trigger a magnetic lock release. But the lock itself was a simple mechanism, powered by a dedicated circuit. She could bypass the encryption entirely. Find the power leads for the maglock. Introduce a surge from her headlamp's battery pack, a trick she'd learned for opening electronically sealed weapons lockers. It was risky. A surge could fry the system, locking it permanently, or it could trigger an alarm. She listened, straining to hear anything beyond the pervasive hum. Nothing. Just the thrum of machinery from deep within the facility. She made her decision. Carefully, using the pliers on her multi-tool, she stripped a tiny section of insulation from 2 wires, the one she identified as the direct power feed to the door's locking mechanism. She then dismantled her headlamp, extracting the powerful lithium-ion battery. It took her 10 minutes of tense, delicate work, her fingers surprisingly nimble in the cool, dry air. She rigged a makeshift connection, took a deep breath, and completed the circuit. There was a sharp crackle, a smell of ozone, and a loud, satisfying thump as the heavy magnetic bolts in the door retracted. The door slid open with a whisper of hydraulics. Success. But the small victory was overshadowed by a chilling realization. The level of security, the sophistication of the engineering. This wasn't a secret storage facility. This was an active, operational base. She stepped through the doorway into a long, white corridor. The air here was even more sterile, the chemical tang stronger. The floor, walls, and ceiling were made of a seamless, off-white polymer, giving the impression of standing inside a massive, bleached bone. The corridor stretched for at least 100 yards, with identical, unmarked doors spaced every 20 feet. The place was unnervingly clean, unnervingly silent, save for the constant, low-frequency hum. A memory surfaced, unbidden, clearing a tunnel complex in Tora Bora. The dark, claustrophobic earth, the smell of cordite and unwashed bodies, the constant fear of booby traps or an enemy lurking around the next corner. This was the opposite of that. Clean, bright, sterile. But the feeling was the same. The feeling of being in a place you were not supposed to be, where death could be behind any door. She needed intelligence. She chose a door at random and examined it. Like the main entrance, it had no handle, only a small card reader. These were not getting the same treatment. She moved on, her headlamp now off, her eyes adjusted to the soft ambient light. She kept to the wall, her boots making no sound on the polymer floor. She was a ghost in this sterile machine. Near the end of the hall, she found a door that was different. It had a small, reinforced window set into it, and the card reader was augmented with a sign, Biohazard Level 3. Authorized personnel only. She peered through the window. Inside was a laboratory. Stainless steel tables, complex glassware, computer monitors displaying scrolling lines of code, and complex molecular diagrams. And in the center of the room, a series of large, transparent containment tanks. Most were empty, but one was not. Inside, floating in a pale, amber liquid, was a deer, or what was left of one. Its body was grotesquely twisted, its fur sloughed off in patches, revealing raw, pink flesh. Unnatural growths, like cancerous cauliflowers, erupted from its flank. Its eyes were wide open, clouded and white. Anya felt a wave of nausea. She had seen the horrific effects of war on human bodies, but this was different. This was a cold, calculated perversion of nature. This was an atrocity conducted in a clean, quiet room. Her gaze shifted from the tank to a computer monitor on a nearby workbench. It displayed a chart. At the top, a title, Project Chimera, Aethelred Corporation, Accelerated Mutagenesis Field Trials, Subject 7B, Aethelred Corporation. The name meant nothing to her, but the implications were monstrous. They were testing something here. A mutagen. And the field trials. What did that mean? Was the field her land? Was this poison seeping into the world above? A cold dread, far deeper than the fear of being caught, settled over her. The sick animals the local vet sometimes talked about. The strange fish kills in the river down the valley. It wasn't random. It was a symptom. This place, this humming tomb beneath her sanctuary, was a cancer. And it was spreading. A sound. Faint, but distinct. The whisper of a door opening at the far end of the corridor. She flattened herself against the wall, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could hear footsteps now. 2 sets. Unhurried, confident. They belonged here. She slid back toward the airlock, melting into the shadows near the junction box she had tampered with. 2 men in crisp, gray uniforms walked past, their faces impassive. They weren't soldiers. They were corporate security. Private military contractors. Their movements were professional, their eyes scanning the corridor with casual vigilance. They didn't even glance in her direction. As they passed the laboratory door, one of them spoke, his voice flat and businesslike. Caldwell wants the new dispersal reports by 0800. Says the aquifer saturation is ahead of schedule, the other grunted in response. Good. The sooner we get the Phase 2 data, the sooner we get paid. They continued down the hall and disappeared through another door. Anya leaned against the wall, her breath catching in her throat. Aquifer saturation. They were deliberately poisoning the water table. Her water. The water for the whole valley. This wasn't just an experiment contained in a lab. The entire region was their laboratory. Her land was ground zero. She slipped back through the main door, her mind reeling. The airlock felt like a decompression chamber, a buffer between the sterile horror below and the living world above. She didn't bother trying to reset the lock. She had a feeling she would be coming back. As she climbed the ladder, the clean, wet scent of the forest filled her lungs, a scent she had taken for granted. It had never smelled so precious. When her head emerged from the opening, Ghost was there, his cold nose bumping against her cheek, whining with concern. She wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in his thick fur. The truce was over. The war had followed her home. Aethelred Corporation. Caldwell. Project Chimera. She had names now. She had a target. The quiet veteran who wanted only to be left alone was gone. In her place was Sergeant Anya Sharma, combat engineer, and this was no longer a reconnaissance mission. This was hostile territory, and she would defend it. The cabin, once a haven, now felt like a forward operating base. The warmth of the fire did not reach the icy core of her resolve. Sleep was a luxury she could not afford. With Ghost lying watch at the door, his ears twitching at every night sound, Anya sat at her small wooden table, a map of the local topography spread out before her. It was an old USGS survey map, creased and worn. Using a pencil, she marked the location of the bunker with a precise X. Then she began to draw. She sketched the streams, the creeks, the underground springs she knew of, all feeding into the Elwha River that snaked through the valley below. Aquifer saturation. The words echoed in her mind. They were using the natural flow of water to spread their poison. She thought of Doc Emmeline in Port Alistair, a woman with kind eyes and hands gnarled from a lifetime of mending animals. 2 months ago, when Anya was in town for supplies, Emmeline had spoken of a worrying trend. It's the fawns, she'd said, her voice heavy with concern. And the fish. Seeing birth defects I've never seen before. Tumors. Liver failure. Something's in the water, Anya. Feels like the whole valley's getting sick at the time. Anya had filed it away as a sad but distant problem. Now, it was a direct accusation. The evidence was all around her, and she had been blind to it. The fight was no longer just about the sanctity of her 40 acres. It was about the entire ecosystem, the town, the people who, like her, had sought peace in this green corner of the world. The next morning, the rain had passed, leaving a sky the color of washed-out denim. The air was crisp and clean, a cruel mockery of the poison lurking beneath. Anya's first move was to secure her perimeter. She spent hours circling her property, not just walking, but observing. She looked for signs of surveillance, disturbed ground, broken twigs, the glint of a lens. She found what she was looking for on a ridge overlooking her cabin. A set of fresh boot prints, military-style tread, and the faint impression of a tripod in the soft earth. They had been watching her. The thought sent a cold fury through her. They had violated her solitude long before she had violated their bunker. This was not a random discovery. It was an inevitable collision. Her next stop was Port Alistair. The drive down the winding gravel road felt different. Every rustle in the woods, every shadow on the road, was a potential threat. She left Ghost at the cabin, his orders the same as always. Watch. He seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, his usual eagerness for a car ride replaced by a quiet, stoic acceptance of his duty. In town, she parked her old pickup truck near the docks, the smell of salt and diesel hanging in the air. Her first visit was to the county records office. Playing the part of a curious landowner, she asked for geological surveys and water table maps of her region. The clerk, a bored young man, pointed her to a dusty archive. She spent an hour poring over the documents, cross-referencing them with her own map. The official data confirmed her fears. Her property sat directly atop a confluence of underground aquifers that fed the entire Elwha watershed. The bunker was perfectly placed for maximum dispersal. It was strategic, malicious. Her second stop was the small-town library. Using their public computer, she began to research Aethelred Corporation. What she found was both bland and terrifying. Aethelred was a massive, multinational biotech firm with a sanitized public image. They specialized in agricultural chemicals, pharmaceuticals, and, according to their glossy website, environmental remediation solutions. It was a labyrinth of shell companies and subsidiaries designed to obfuscate and deflect. But digging deeper into financial news archives, she found whispers of scandals, illegal dumping in South America, accusations of unethical human trials in Asia, all quietly settled out of court for vast sums of money. They were professional predators, cloaked in corporate respectability. And their security division was a who's who of former special operations soldiers from various countries. Men who had traded their flags for a paycheck. Men like Caldwell. A chill went through her. These were not thugs. They were professionals, on a level she understood all too well. As she was leaving the library, a man stepped out of an alleyway, blocking her path. He was tall, dressed in expensive hiking gear that looked like it had never seen a trail. His smile was easy, but his eyes were cold and analytical. "Miss Sharma," he said. His voice was calm, pleasant. "I was hoping I might have a word. My name is Caldwell." It wasn't a question. Anya's body went rigid. Her hand instinctively moved to where a sidearm would be. But there was nothing there but the rough denim of her jeans. She kept her face neutral, her voice flat. "I don't know you. I think you do," he said, his smile tightening slightly. "Or at least, you know my employers. We seem to have a mutual interest in a certain piece of property." He took a step closer. His proximity was an act of intimidation. "You're a hard woman to find. Very determined to be left alone. I respect that. My employers respect that. In fact, they're willing to pay for your continued privacy. I'm not for sale," Anya said, her voice a low growl. Caldwell's pleasant demeanor didn't falter. "Everyone has a price, Miss Sharma. And Aethelred's pockets are very deep. We're prepared to offer you 8 figures to purchase your land and a binding non-disclosure agreement. You could go anywhere, disappear completely. Isn't that what you've always wanted?" The offer hung in the air, obscene in its magnitude. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine it. A new life, somewhere far away. No humming, no fight. But then the image of the deer in the tank flashed in her mind. The thought of Doc Emmeline's worried face. The feel of Ghost's trusting head under her hand. This land wasn't just dirt and trees. It was the place she had come to heal. It was home. Selling it would be like selling her own soul. "The answer is no," she said, her gaze unwavering. Caldwell's mask of civility finally slipped. The smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold, professional appraisal. "That's a pity," he said softly. "We prefer the simple, clean transaction. But we are also adept at more complex solutions. You're a soldier. You understand mission objectives. Our objective on that land will be met, with or without your cooperation. I strongly suggest you reconsider the consequences of being an obstacle." He gestured behind her. A black SUV with tinted windows was parked across the street. She hadn't even noticed it. Another failure of awareness. She was rusty. Think about what you have to lose, Caldwell said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. It's a lonely piece of land. A lot can happen out there. Accidents. Fires. It would be a shame for your peace to be disturbed. Permanently. He stepped aside, clearing her path. It was a dismissal. The meeting was over. Anya walked past him, her back straight, every muscle screaming with the instinct to fight. But this wasn't the place. He wasn't the target. He was a messenger. As she got into her truck, she saw him in her rearview mirror, speaking into his wrist like a character from a spy movie. He gave her one last, cold look before getting into the black SUV. The message was clear. The negotiation was over. The war had been declared. Driving back to the cabin, the beautiful landscape seemed menacing. The shadows between the trees were deeper, the familiar road now a gauntlet. They knew who she was. They knew where she lived. And they had just threatened the one thing she had left to lose. Not the land, not the cabin, but the quiet, loyal soul waiting for her there. The threat lingered in the air long after the black SUV was gone from her rearview mirror. Think about what you have to lose. The words were a poison dart, aimed at the most vulnerable part of her. When she finally pulled up to the cabin, Ghost came bounding out, his tail a blur of joyful motion. The sight of his unadulterated happiness was a sharp, painful counterpoint to the cold dread that had taken root in her. She knelt and gathered him in her arms, his familiar, earthy scent a grounding force. "They're not getting you, boy," she whispered into his fur, a vow spoken to the only witness that mattered. "They're not getting any of this." That night, she transformed the cabin. It was no longer a home. It was a defensive position. She dug out her old military field manuals on demolitions and field fortifications. The knowledge came back to her as if it had only been dormant, waiting for the right signal. She rigged a simple but effective early warning system. A series of tripwires made from fishing line, connected to tin cans filled with pebbles, placed at key approaches to the cabin. It was low-tech, but reliable. She reinforced the doors and shuttered the windows, leaving only small, strategic firing ports, just as she had done in 100 forgotten outposts in the sand. She checked her hunting rifle, a bolt-action 30-06. It was a powerful, accurate weapon, but slow. Against a team of professionals, it was almost useless. Her only other weapon was a K-bar knife, its edge honed to a razor sharpness. She was outgunned, outnumbered. But this was her ground. She knew its every dip and fold, every tree and rock. That was her advantage. The next day, the escalation came, just as she knew it would. It wasn't a direct assault. That wasn't their style. It was psychological. While she was on a patrol of her northern perimeter, she heard a sharp yelp from the direction of the cabin. A sound of pain. Her blood ran cold. She sprinted back, her heart pounding with a terror she hadn't felt even in the worst firefights. She burst into the clearing to see Ghost limping, favoring his front right paw. Lying near the porch was a small, dark object. A drone. It had been hovering low, and when Ghost had barked at it, it had discharged a small electrical shock, a targeted jolt of pain, before flying away. She rushed to him, her hands gently probing his leg. The injury wasn't serious, a minor burn and a sprain, but the intent was clear. It was a message. We can touch you whenever we want. We can hurt what you love. The fury that rose in her was a white-hot, clarifying force. It burned away the last vestiges of fear and hesitation. They had crossed a line from which there was no retreat. They had targeted her dog. The decision crystallized in her mind, hard and sharp as a diamond. She would no longer be on the defensive. She would no longer wait for their next move. She was going to take the fight to them. She was going back into the bunker. But not just to snoop. This time, she would go in to cripple them, to gather undeniable proof, and, if possible, to throw a wrench so big into their machine that they would be forced to stop. A memory surfaced, a flashback so vivid she could taste the dust in her mouth. A night raid in Kandahar. Her unit was tasked with capturing a high-value target. The intel was bad. The compound was a labyrinth, rigged with explosives. Her team leader, a good man named Sergeant Miller, hesitated at a critical moment, unsure of the right path. That hesitation cost him his life and the lives of 2 other soldiers. Anya had learned the lesson in Blood and Fire. When the enemy is on your doorstep, hesitation is a death sentence. Decisiveness is survival. That evening, She began her preparations. It was a ritual she knew well, the methodical process of gearing up for a mission. She packed a small go bag, water, high-energy rations, a first aid kit, her multi-tool, and a roll of duct tape. She sharpened her K-bar. She cleaned the 30-06, the scent of gun oil a strange, nostalgic perfume. But her most important preparation was mental. She sat before the fire, Ghost's head resting on her lap, his injured paw bandaged. She closed her eyes and walked through the mission in her mind. Entry: infiltration. Objective: exfiltration. She visualized the corridors of the bunker, the lab, the containment tank. She visualized Caldwell's cold, confident face. She played out scenarios, contingencies, potential ambushes. She let the rage settle, cooling it from a wild fire into a focused, blue-hot flame. This wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. It was about reclaiming her peace by force. Before dawn, she was ready. She dressed in dark, durable clothing that wouldn't snag or rustle. She painted her face with mud and charcoal from the fire pit, breaking up the pale outline of her skin. She looked at her reflection in a dark window pane and saw a ghost from her past staring back. The soldier she thought she had left behind. She knelt and looked Ghost in the eye. He whined softly, licking her cheek, sensing the change in her, the grim purpose. "I'll be back," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "You stay? You watch." She slipped out of the cabin and into the pre-dawn gloom, melting into the familiar woods. But this time, she wasn't a recluse seeking solitude. She was a hunter. The forest was no longer her sanctuary. It was her ally, her cover for movement. She moved with a silent, purposeful grace, her rifle held at a low ready, her senses alive, every fiber of her being focused on the humming darkness that lay buried ahead. The soldier was going back to war, in the last place on earth she had ever expected to find it. The approach was a slow, methodical stalk. Anya moved through the forest not as a hiker, but as an infiltrator. She used the terrain, moving from one point of cover to the next, pausing frequently to listen and observe. The half-moon provided just enough light to navigate, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like specters. The world was rendered in shades of gray and black, a landscape perfectly suited to her mood. She circled the bunker entrance, completing a full 360-degree reconnaissance before committing to an approach. She found no new signs of activity, no sentries, no obvious traps. Their arrogance was their weakness. They believed their technology and their isolation made them invulnerable. They had underestimated the local fauna. She reached the heavy composite slab and found it as she had left it, slightly ajar. They hadn't even bothered to check it. She lifted the hatch, the hydraulics sighing softly in the quiet woods, and listened for a long moment before starting her descent. The silence from within was more unnerving than an alarm. Once inside the airlock, she paused again, her ears straining against the ever-present hum. The door she had bypassed stood open, a dark maw leading into the sterile white corridor. She didn't re-enter immediately. Instead, she took out the roll of duct tape from her pack. She carefully placed a small, folded piece on the bottom of the heavy vault door, creating a tiny, almost invisible wedge. If someone tried to close it from a remote control center, it would fail to seal completely. A small detail, but small details kept you alive. She slipped into the main corridor, a shadow against the white walls. This time, her objective was different. It wasn't just to see. It was to find the heart of the operation. The control room. The data center. The place where Project Chimera was managed. She moved past the lab with the grotesque deer, her jaw tight. She ignored the other identical doors, trusting her instincts. A facility like this would have a logical layout. The sensitive areas, the command and control, would be centralized and heavily protected. She followed the main artery of the complex, her eyes scanning for any deviation in the pattern, any sign that indicated a more important function. She found it 50 yards deeper into the complex. A corridor branching to the left, marked by a subtle increase in the number of conduits running along the ceiling. More power, more data. This was the nerve center. This corridor was different. It was darker, the soft lights spaced further apart. And here, there were cameras. Small, black domes mounted in the corners, their tiny red lights indicating they were active. She stayed low, using the pools of shadow between the lights, moving with a painful slowness. Each step was a calculated risk. The corridor ended at a single, reinforced door. It had the same card reader as the others, but this one was flanked by 2 cameras and a motion sensor. There would be no simple bypass here. But as she got closer, she saw something that made her breath catch. The door was propped open. Just a crack. A sliver of brighter light bled from within. Carelessness. Or a trap. Her training screamed, trap. But her gut, honed by a different kind of instinct, told her it was arrogance. The same arrogance that left the main hatch unsecured. She approached the door like a bomb technician approaching a live device. She listened. Voices. Muffled, but clear enough. One voice was calm, authoritative. Caldwell. The other was agitated, nervous. The dispersal rate is too aggressive, the nervous voice said. The geological survey was incomplete. We're seeing leakage into the Quileute watershed. That's outside the designated test zone. If the EPA gets a reading from there, the EPA is not a concern. Caldwell's voice cut in, cold and sharp. Our partners in the agency will ensure any anomalous readings are recalibrated. Your job is not to worry about the EPA. Your job is to collate the data. Stick to your job, Doctor. A pause. Anya pressed her ear closer to the cold steel. But the mutations, the doctor's voice was almost a whisper. They're unstable. We're seeing cross-species contamination. It's not just deer. We've had avian subjects, aquatic. It's adapting faster than the models predicted. This isn't a targeted mutagen. It's a plague. It's a product, Caldwell corrected him. A highly effective, next-generation herbicide. The most effective in history. The side effects are a manageable externality. Aethelred's legal department is more than capable of managing them. Now, I need the final projection for Phase 3. The board is getting impatient. Anya pulled back from the door, her mind racing. A herbicide. They were creating a chemical that would kill everything, and they were testing it on an entire ecosystem, her ecosystem, just to get it to market faster. The casual monstrosity of it was breathtaking. This was her chance. The door was open. The head of security was inside, and he had just confirmed everything. She needed proof. Something tangible. Something she could walk out with. She peered through the crack. The room inside was a control center. A wall of monitors displayed maps, data streams, and live camera feeds from all over the facility. Caldwell stood with his back to her, looking at the main screen. The other man, a scientist in a lab coat, was hunched over a console. A data drive, a small silver rectangle, sat on the console next to his hand. That was it. That was the proof. She formulated a plan in a split second. It was desperate. It was reckless. It was her only option. She needed a diversion. Her eyes darted around the corridor. The fire suppression system. A small, red box on the wall. Smashing it would trigger the alarms, possibly a deluge of foam or water. It would create chaos. Chaos was her ally. She gripped her K-bar, the cold handle of familiar comfort. She took a deep breath, centered herself, and exploded into action. With 2 powerful strides, she was at the alarm box. She brought the pommel of her knife down hard on the glass cover. A piercing siren shrieked to life, echoing through the concrete tomb. Red lights began to flash, bathing the white corridor in a hellish crimson glow. What the hell? Caldwell's voice barked from inside the room. Anya didn't wait. As the doctor looked up, startled, and Caldwell turned toward the door, she burst in. She wasn't aiming for Caldwell. She was aiming for the lights. With a swing of her Halligan bar, which she had carried silently on her back, she smashed the main light panel on the wall. The room plunged into darkness, save for the chaotic strobing of the red emergency lights and the glow of the computer monitors. Intruder, Caldwell yelled, his voice calm despite the chaos. He was already moving, drawing a sidearm she hadn't seen. The doctor screamed, cowering behind his console. Anya ignored them both. In the disorienting flashes of red light, she vaulted over a desk, her target singular, the data drive. She scooped it from the console, her fingers closing around the cool metal. She had it. Now, exfiltration. A muzzle flash lit the room, deafeningly loud in the enclosed space. A bullet sparked off the wall just past her head. Caldwell was good. Frighteningly good. He was already tracking her in the dark. She didn't run for the door she'd come through. He would expect that. She dove behind a bank of servers, the sirens wailing, the red lights painting a scene from a nightmare. She was trapped in the nerve center of the hornet's nest, with their deadliest soldier, and she had just stolen their secret. The fight for her life had begun. The darkness, punctuated by the rhythmic strobing of the crimson alarm lights, was a chaotic battlefield. The wail of the siren was a physical pressure, making it impossible to hear footsteps or breathing. Anya crouched behind the server bank, her own heart hammering a frantic counter-rhythm to the alarm. She had the data drive. That was primary. Survival was secondary, but essential for the primary to matter. Caldwell was a professional. He wouldn't spray and pray. He would move, use the strobing darkness to his advantage, and try to flank her. She had to move first. In the brief flash of red light, she saw his silhouette moving to her left, trying to get a clear angle. In the next moment of darkness, she scrambled in the opposite direction, staying low, her boots silent on the smooth floor. The room was a maze of consoles and equipment. Cover, but also a trap. "You can't hide in my house, Sergeant." Caldwell's voice cut through the din, unnervingly calm. He knew. He must have seen her face in the initial chaos. He knew who she was. "I've read your file. Anya Sharma. Combat engineer. Decorated. Honorable discharge. A real hero. What a waste. Playing eco-terrorist in the woods, he was trying to draw her out, to make her angry, to make her make a mistake." She shoved the data drive deep into a pocket and gripped her K-bar. Her rifle was useless in these close quarters. This would be primitive. In the next flash of light, she saw him, 10 feet away, his pistol up, scanning. In the darkness that followed, she threw a spare battery from her pack against the far wall. It clattered to the ground. Caldwell spun and fired twice at the sound, the muzzle flashes briefly illuminating his intense, focused face. It was the opening she needed. While he was oriented on the decoy, she lunged, not at him, but at a heavy rolling chair, sending it careening into the back of his legs. He grunted in surprise as his balance broke, his shot going wide into the ceiling. She was on him in an instant, a whirlwind of desperate, focused violence. She drove her shoulder into his side, slamming him against a console. The impact knocked the wind out of him, but he was strong, incredibly so. His arm, the one with the gun, was pinned between their bodies. His other hand clawed for her face. She brought her knee up hard into his thigh, striking a pressure point. His leg buckled. She twisted, using his own weight against him, and brought the pommel of her knife down on his wrist. A sickening crunch, and the gun clattered to the floor. He roared in pain and fury, shoving her back with a surge of strength. She stumbled, regaining her footing as he came at her, his left hand now a claw, his right arm hanging useless. He was a wounded animal, all the more dangerous. The scientist, the doctor, was gibbering in a corner, completely useless. This was between the two soldiers. Caldwell lunged, and she met him, not with force, but with a fluid redirection she'd learned in a dozen dusty dojos. She sidestepped, letting his momentum carry him past her, and drove the edge of her hand into the side of his neck. He staggered, but didn't fall. He was impossibly tough. He turned, his face a mask of hate in the flashing red light. "You just signed your own death warrant," he snarled. He came at her again, and this time she didn't have room to maneuver. He crashed into her, driving her back against the wall of monitors. The screens flickered and died as they slammed into them. His weight was crushing, his one good hand closing around her throat. Black spots danced in her vision. Her lungs burned. Her K-bar was still in her hand. With the last of her strength, she rammed the blade upward, not the point, but the flat of the hilt, into the soft spot under his jaw. His head snapped back. His grip loosened. She gasped for air and drove the knife, this time with a precise, economical thrust, into the meat of his shoulder, twisting it. He screamed, a raw, guttural sound of agony, and fell back. She didn't wait to see if he would get up. She scooped his pistol from the floor, a SIG Sauer P226, familiar and solid in her hand, and sprinted for the door. The corridor was still a flashing red nightmare. From down the hall, she could hear shouting and the sound of running feet. Security was responding. She had seconds. She ran, not back the way she came, but deeper into the facility. They would expect her to run for the exit. They would converge on the airlock. She had to find another way out. The plan she had seen on the control room monitors, for a brief second before smashing them, had shown a ventilation shaft, a large, primary exhaust port, on the far side of the complex. It was a long shot. She rounded a corner, and came face to face with two more security guards, their rifles up. She didn't hesitate. She fired twice, two precise shots to center mass. They weren't soldiers defending a country. They were mercenaries protecting a poison factory. Her hesitation was long gone. They dropped without a sound. She didn't check on them. She kept moving, the layout of the facility a half-formed map in her mind. The hum was different here, louder, interspersed with the roar of massive fans. The ventilation nexus. She found the access hatch set into the wall, a simple wheel lock. She spun it, the metal groaning in protest, and pulled the heavy door open. A blast of hot, foul-smelling air hit her. It was the exhaust from the labs, from the machinery, from the very lungs of this sick place. Inside was a ladder leading up into a cavernous, dark shaft, at least 10 feet in diameter. High above, she could see a faint glimmer of gray light. The surface. She climbed in, pulling the heavy door shut behind her just as more guards rounded the corner, their flashlight beams cutting through the red haze. She was in the shaft. Now the climb. The ladder was slick with a greasy condensation. The air was thick and hard to breathe. The roar of the fans below was deafening. She climbed, hand over hand, her muscles screaming in protest. Her body was a collection of bruises and scrapes, but adrenaline and purpose were a powerful fuel. The climb was an eternity. 20 feet. 50. 80. The gray light above grew larger, resolving into a circular grill. The main exhaust port. As she neared the top, she felt the pull of the outside air, fresh and clean, even mixed with the facility's foul breath. The grill was held in place by heavy bolts. She holstered the pistol and pulled out her multi-tool. Her fingers were numb, her arms shaking with fatigue, but she worked the bolts one by one. They were stiff with rust and grime. Each one was a battle. Finally, the last bolt came free. She pushed the massive steel grill. It swung open on a hidden hinge, a circle of blessed, overcast sky. She hauled herself out onto a concrete slab, gasping the cool, damp air. She was in a thicket of rhododendrons, 100 yards from the main hatch she had first discovered. She had made it. She was out. She lay on the wet ground for a moment, the rain beginning to fall again, washing the grime and sweat from her face. She was bruised, battered, and exhausted. But in her pocket, she could feel the hard, rectangular shape of the data drive. She had the proof. She had won the battle. But as she staggered to her feet and began the slow, painful journey back to her cabin, she knew the war was far from over. Caldwell was alive. Aethelred was a global corporation. She hadn't killed the beast. She had just stolen its cub. And now, the mother would be coming for her. The journey back to the cabin was a fugue state of pain and adrenaline. Every step was a negotiation with her battered body. The forest, usually a comfort, felt alien and threatening, every shadow a potential ambush. She moved on pure instinct, the soldier's muscle memory taking over where conscious thought failed. The sight of her cabin, still standing and silent in the gray morning light, was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She stumbled through the door and collapsed, the borrowed pistol clattering to the floor. Ghost was on her instantly, whining, licking her face, his presence a warm, living anchor in the swirling chaos of her mind. His injured paw was a stark reminder of why she had done this. She lay there for a long time, the dog a warm weight against her side, letting the reality of her survival wash over her. She was alive. She was home. But the home was no longer safe. She pushed herself up, her body a symphony of aches. First things first, she checked the data drive. Her laptop was an old, offline machine she used for writing and storing photos. It had no network card, no Wi-Fi, no Bluetooth. It was a digital island, secure in its isolation. She plugged in the drive. The laptop whirred, recognizing the hardware. A single folder appeared on the screen, Project Chimera. Inside were thousands of files. Research data, chemical compositions, dispersal projections, financial records, internal memos. And a subfolder titled Risk Management. She clicked it. It contained profiles, environmental activists, local journalists, politicians, and a file named Sharma, her file. It had her military records, a psychological profile that was chillingly accurate, and surveillance photos of her on her own land. There were notes from Caldwell. Subject is highly capable, isolated, and displays symptoms of severe PTSD. Conventional intimidation may be ineffective or counterproductive. Proposing asset acquisition as first option. If declined, move to terminal neutralization. Terminal neutralization. A clean, corporate phrase for murder. They had been planning to kill her all along. But there was more. The drive contained correspondence between Aethelred executives and officials within the Environmental Protection Agency. Names, bank account numbers, encrypted emails detailing a conspiracy to falsify water quality reports and fast-track the approval of Chimera once the field trials were complete. This was bigger than she could have ever imagined. It wasn't just corporate malfeasance. It was a full-blown conspiracy reaching into the heart of the government agencies meant to protect them. She couldn't just dump this on the internet. Aethelred's legal team would bury it, discredit her as a disgruntled, unstable veteran. Their allies in the government would make it disappear. She needed an ally, someone on the ground, someone with authority, but who was outside the circle of corruption. Sheriff Brody. He was a man carved from the local timber, gruff and skeptical, but with a reputation for being stubbornly, almost foolishly, honest. He had no love for federal agencies, and even less for slick corporate outsiders. He was her only shot. She copied the essential files onto a new, clean USB drive. She then took the original Aethelred drive and the borrowed SIG sour, wrapped them in an oilcloth, and sealed them in a waterproof bag. She needed to hide them, an insurance policy. She took Ghost and walked to the oldest tree on her property, a massive, gnarled cedar that had stood for centuries. At its base, hidden among the tangled roots, was a hollow. She placed the package deep inside and covered the opening with rocks and moss. If something happened to her, the evidence would remain. The rest of the day was spent preparing for the inevitable. She knew Caldwell, or whoever was in charge now, would not wait long. They would come, and they would come in force. She couldn't defend the cabin. It was a wooden box, a death trap. Her only chance was to use the terrain, to turn her 40 acres into a fortress of her own making. She worked with a feverish intensity, Ghost shadowing her every move. She didn't build walls. She built channels. She used fallen logs and natural depressions to create kill zones, fields of fire that all led back to a final, defensible position she had chosen on a rocky outcrop that gave her a commanding view of the main approaches. She created diversions, false trails, and simple but effective booby traps, not to kill, but to maim and disorient. A pit filled with sharpened stakes, concealed by a thin layer of branches and leaves. A tripwire connected to a heavy, swinging log. These were the old ways, the primitive tactics of a guerrilla fighter, learned not in a classroom, but from the enemies she had once fought. As dusk fell, a heavy fog rolled in from the coast, blanketing the forest in a thick, sound-dampening shroud. The world shrank to a visibility of 20 feet. The fog was a double-edged sword. It would conceal her, but it would also conceal them. She took her position on the outcrop, her 30-06 resting on a rock, its scope useless in the gloom. This would be Ironsight's work. Close and dirty. She had her K-bar, Caldwell's pistol, and 2 extra magazines she had found on the guard she'd shot. It wasn't enough. Ghost lay beside her, perfectly still, his body a tense coil of potential energy. He would be her ears. An hour passed, then another. The silence was absolute, broken only by the drip of condensation from the trees. Her senses were stretched to their breaking point. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of a leaf, could be them. Then, Ghost's head lifted. A low, almost inaudible growl vibrated in his chest. His ears were locked on the path leading from the cabin. They were here. She peered into the fog, her heart a slow, heavy drum. She saw them before she heard them. 3 figures, moving slowly, cautiously, their forms indistinct gray shapes in the murk. They carried short-barreled rifles with tactical lights, but they weren't using them, relying on night vision. They were moving in a standard wedge formation, professionals. She waited. Let them come closer. Let them commit. They passed the first of her tripwires, a simple noisemaker can, and didn't even flinch. They were too good for that. They were following her tracks from the cabin, straight into the channel she had prepared for them. One of them stepped onto the concealed covering of the pit. There was a muffled curse, a sickening crunch, and he disappeared. The other 2 froze, instantly dropping to a crouch, their rifles scanning the fog. Contact! One of them whispered into his radio. Man down. Anya smiled. A grim, humorless expression. One down. She raised her rifle, the iron sights lining up on the center of the closest silhouette. She controlled her breathing, exhaling slowly, squeezing the trigger. The roar of the 30-06 shattered the silence, a physical blow in the thick fog. The figure was thrown backward, vanishing into the gray. The third man immediately opened fire, a stream of automatic fire ripping through the trees where he thought the shot had come from. He was firing blind, panicking. She had him. She worked the bolt on her rifle, the smooth, mechanical action of familiar comfort. She shifted her position, crawling 10 feet to the left. The man was still firing, wasting his ammunition. He stopped, listening. The silence rushed back in, heavier than before. Caldwell, do you copy? He whispered frantically into his radio. We are compromised. Request immediate. He never finished the sentence. A gray and white blur erupted from the shadows beside Anya. Ghost. He had been waiting for her signal, a silent touch to his flank. He moved with a speed that was terrifying, a silent predator in his element. The man screamed as Ghost hit him, a 200-pound projectile of muscle and fury. The rifle discharged into the air, and then there was only the sound of a desperate struggle, which ended as quickly as it began. Silence. Anya rose, her rifle at the ready, and moved cautiously toward the scene. Ghost stood over the downed man, his fur bristling, a low growl in his chest. He was unhurt. Good boy, she breathed, her voice shaking slightly. Good boy, it was over. For now. But she knew this was just the first wave. Caldwell was still out there, and he would be furious. She had to get the evidence to Brody. She had to end this. She grabbed the dead men's radios and ammunition, and with Ghost at her side, began the long, dark walk toward town. The war for her quiet piece of land had turned into a running battle, and she was now, officially, a fugitive. The drive to Port Alistair was a descent into a different kind of danger. The foggy, winding road that had once been a mere inconvenience was now a gauntlet of potential ambushes. Anya drove without headlights, navigating by memory and the faint glow of the moon through the thinning fog. She kept Caldwell's pistol on the seat beside her, the USB drive a hard, vital lump in her pocket. Ghost sat in the passenger seat, no longer a pet but a co-pilot, his head on a constant swivel, his ears processing a world of sound beyond her own. Every pair of headlights in the distance was a potential threat, every darkened pull-off a potential kill zone. She didn't drive directly to the sheriff's office. That would be the first place they'd look. Instead, she parked her truck 2 blocks away in the shadow of a cannery and proceeded on foot, sticking to the dark alleys and back ways of the sleeping town. The salt-laced air was cold, and the silence of the town was a stark contrast to the violence she had just left behind in the woods. The sheriff's office was a small, unassuming brick building, a single light burning in a window. She didn't go to the front door. She circled around back, to a private entrance she knew Brody sometimes used. She found him there, leaning against his patrol car, sipping coffee from a thermos. He was a big man, his uniform straining at the seams, his face a roadmap of long nights and small-town troubles. He looked up as she emerged from the shadows, his hand instinctively going to the grip of his holstered weapon. Sharma, he said, his voice a low rumble of surprise. Bit late for a social call, isn't it? We need to talk, Sheriff, she said, her voice low and urgent. Not here. He studied her face for a long moment, taking in the mud, the exhaustion, and the hard, grim set of her jaw. He saw the soldier she was, not just the reclusive woman who bought supplies once a month. He nodded slowly. My office, inside, under the buzzing fluorescent lights, the full extent of her condition was apparent. He looked at the bruises on her face, the tear in her jacket. Looks like you had a rough night, he said, his tone carefully neutral. You could say that, Anya replied. She pulled the USB drive from her pocket and placed it on his desk. There's a corporation called Aethelred. They have a secret, illegal facility on my land. They're developing some kind of chemical weapon, a mutagen, and they're poisoning the water table. The entire valley. Brody leaned back in his chair, his expression skeptical. That's a hell of an accusation, Sharma. You got any proof? It's all on there, she said, nodding at the drive. Research data, internal memos, financial records, and evidence of a conspiracy with the EPA to cover it up. There are also 3 bodies on my property. Their security team. They came for me tonight. Brody's skepticism evaporated, replaced by a look of grim seriousness. He sat forward, his eyes locked on hers. 3 bodies. They gave me no choice, she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. It was them or me. He was silent for a long time, his gaze distant. He was a small-town sheriff, used to dealing with drunk fishermen and domestic disputes. This was something else entirely. This was the kind of trouble that could swallow a man whole. You know what you're asking me to do? He said finally. You're asking me to declare war on a multi-billion-dollar corporation and their friends in the federal government. They'll crush me. They'll crush this whole town, I know, Anya said. But look at this. She took out her laptop, which she'd brought in her pack, and showed him the files. She showed him the video from the lab, the deer in the tank. She showed him the dispersal maps, the red zones of contamination spreading through the aquifers, straight toward the town. She showed him Doc Emmeline's name in the risk management file. He stared at the screen, his face growing pale. He saw the names of his own neighbors, people he'd known his whole life, listed as acceptable collateral damage. The fight went out of his eyes, replaced by a slow-burning anger. That son of a bitch, he muttered. I've lived here my whole life. Drank this water my whole life. He stood up and began to pace the small office. He was a lawman. The law was being broken in the most profound way imaginable. But the law was also being wielded as a weapon by the criminals. He was trapped. If I go public with this, he said, thinking aloud, their lawyers will tie it up in court for a decade. Their PR firms will paint you as a lunatic. They'll say I'm a hick sheriff on a power trip. They'll bury us in paper, so we don't go public, Anya said. Not yet. We don't fight them in the press. We fight them on the ground. Brody stopped pacing and looked at her. What are you suggesting? They think they've contained the situation, Anya explained. They think I'm either dead or on the run. They'll be sending in a cleanup crew to scrub the facility and retrieve their data. But their primary server is still there. The drive I took is just a copy. The motherlode is still in that bunker. If we can secure that server, the physical hardware, they have nothing. No plausible deniability. Brody stared at her as if she were insane. You want me, a 50-year-old sheriff with a bad knee, to help you assault a black site facility full of mercenaries? I don't need you to breach the door, Sheriff. I need you to hold the perimeter. I need you to be the law. When I bring that server out, I'm handing it over to you. On public land, in front of witnesses. Your deputies. You make an official seizure of evidence. Once it's in your custody, officially, they can't just make it disappear. It's part of an active homicide investigation. Your homicide investigation, it was a crazy, desperate plan. But it was also brilliant. It used Brody's legal authority as a shield and a sword. It turned Aethelred's own secrecy against them. Brody looked from Anya to Ghost, who sat silently by the door, a picture of lethal loyalty. He looked at the map on his wall, the blue lines of the rivers and streams that were the lifeblood of his home. He thought of his grandchildren, who swam in those rivers. He made his decision. All right, Sharma, he sighed, running a hand over his tired face. Looks like my retirement is going to have to wait. When do we do this? Now, Anya said. They'll be moving at first light. We have to beat them to it. Brody picked up his radio. Dispatch, this is Brody. Call in deputies Miller and Chun. Tell them to meet me at the old logging road turnoff on Highway 101. Tell them it's a priority call. And tell my wife I'm going to be late for breakfast. He looked at Anya, a new, hard light in his eyes. Let's go to war, Sergeant. The unlikely alliance was forged. The wounded soldier, the weary sheriff, and the silent, faithful dog. Together, they drove back into the darkness, toward the humming heart of the sickness that lay buried beneath the woods, to make one final, desperate stand for their home. The sky was beginning to lighten from black to a deep, bruised purple as they reached the turnoff. Deputies Miller and Chun were already there, their patrol cars parked discreetly behind a stand of alder. They were young, barely out of their 20s, and their faces were a mixture of confusion and apprehension as Sheriff Brody laid out the plan. He kept it simple, omitting the more fantastic details. We have a warrant to seize evidence from a property up this road related to an ongoing investigation, Brody said, his voice leaving no room for argument. There may be armed resistance. Sharma is acting as a consultant. Our job is containment. No one gets in or out without my authorization. You'll set up a roadblock here. Understood. They nodded, their eyes wide. They understood the gravity, if not the specifics. Brody was drawing a line in the sand, using the full, albeit limited, authority of his office. Anya, Brody, and Ghost took the sheriff's unmarked SUV up the rutted logging road, stopping a half-mile from her property line. "This is as far as we go," Anya said. "From here, we're on foot. And we go quiet." They moved through the woods, Brody surprisingly nimble for his size, his years of hunting in these same forests paying off. They found the bodies of the security team where Anya had left them. Brody checked their pulses, his face grim. "All right," he said, his voice tight. "We have a crime scene. 3 homicides. That gives me everything I need." He posted himself in a concealed position with a clear view of the bunker entrance and the surrounding area, his service shotgun resting across his lap. "You get that server," he told Anya. "I'll make sure nobody interrupts you." Anya gave him a single, sharp nod. "Ghost, stay," she commanded. The dog looked from her to Brody, seeming to understand his new role as the sheriff's guardian. He lay down beside the big lawman, a silent promise of protection. Anya moved toward the bunker alone. The forest was waking up, the birds beginning their morning chorus, oblivious to the human drama about to unfold. She reached the ventilation shaft she had escaped from. It was her only way back in. They would have the main entrance locked down and guarded. She slipped back into the foul-smelling darkness, the climb down even more treacherous than the climb up. Her muscles burned, but her mind was clear, focused on the objective. Once inside, she moved with silent speed through the familiar corridors. The facility was on high alert. The red emergency lights were off, but the tension was palpable. She could hear distant, urgent voices over an intercom system. She reached the control room. The door was closed, the damage from her fight with Caldwell hastily patched. She listened. Silence. They had likely moved their command center, or they were waiting for the cleanup crew to arrive. She didn't have time for subtlety. She wedged the tines of her Halligan bar into the seam of the door and put her entire weight into it. The metal groaned, screeched, and then burst inward. The room was empty. The body of the scientist was gone. But the main server rack was still there, a monolith of blinking green lights. It was a custom-built, hardened system designed to withstand physical trauma. She couldn't just pull the drives. She had to take the whole thing. She disconnected the thick bundles of cables, working with frantic haste. She found a heavy-duty dolly in a storage closet, a stroke of luck, and managed to wrestle the massive server unit onto it. It was immensely heavy, a dead weight of secrets and lies. Now the hard part, getting it out. The main corridor was a death trap. She had to use the service tunnels. She consulted the facility map she had memorized, a blueprint of her escape. There was a secondary maintenance tunnel that ran parallel to the main corridor, leading directly to the airlock chamber. It would be tight, but it was possible. Pushing the heavy dolly, she moved into the narrow, dimly lit service tunnel. It was a claustrophobic space, filled with pipes and conduits. The wheels of the dolly scraped and bumped, the noise echoing loudly in the confined space. Halfway to the airlock, she heard it. Footsteps, coming from ahead. She flattened herself into an alcove, her heart pounding. 2 figures appeared, dressed in full hazmat suits, their faces obscured by respirators. The cleanup crew. They were moving slowly, methodically, spraying the walls with some kind of decontaminant. They hadn't seen her. She waited until they passed, her breath held tight in her chest. Then she continued her slow, agonizing journey. She reached the airlock. The main vault door was closed, the duct tape she had placed there gone. They had sealed it. She was trapped. No, not trapped. She was an engineer. She looked at the junction box she had bypassed before. It was repaired, a new cover plate installed. She set to work again, her tools a blur of motion. She didn't have time for the battery trick. This time, it was brute force. She ripped the cover off and found the primary release circuit. Using the insulated handles of her pliers, she shorted the connection. A shower of sparks, a loud bang, and the smell of fried electronics. The vault door shuttered, then slid open 6 inches before grinding to a halt. The system was fried, but it was open enough. She squeezed through the gap, then used the Halligan bar to painstakingly winch the heavy dolly through after her. She was in the final chamber, the ladder to the surface just feet away. She could hear the clean forest air. She was almost there. Then she heard a voice from the corridor behind her. "Going somewhere, Sergeant?" "Caldwell." He stood at the partially opened door, his arm in a sling, his face a swollen, purple mask of fury. In his good hand, he held a pistol. "You've been a bigger pain in the ass than the entire insurgency in Helmand Province," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "But it ends here. Give me the server." Anya stood between him and the ladder, her own pistol raised. "It's over, Caldwell. The sheriff is up there. The whole area is a crime scene." Caldwell laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "A small-town sheriff? You think he can stop us? My team will be here in 10 minutes. We'll sanitize this whole valley. There won't be a body, a shred of evidence, or a living witness left. Now, step away from the server." This was it. The final confrontation. Not in the desert, but in a concrete box under the earth. "No," Anya said. He raised his pistol. Anya fired first. Her shot went wide, ricocheting off the concrete wall. His shot was better, tearing through the flesh of her left shoulder. The pain was a blinding, white-hot flash. She stumbled back, her arm going numb. He advanced into the room, a predator moving in for the kill. But as he stepped through the door, he didn't see the halogen bar she had left braced against the damaged hydraulic mechanism. With a groan of protesting metal, the half-open vault door, freed from its precarious position, slammed shut. It caught Caldwell's leg, severing it just below the knee. His scream was inhuman, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony that echoed in the small chamber. He collapsed, his pistol skittering away. Anya, clutching her bleeding shoulder, looked at him, a writhing, broken thing on the floor. There was no triumph, only a vast, weary sadness. She kicked his pistol away, then turned to the ladder. She had to get the server out. She looked at the dolly, then at the ladder, then at her useless arm. It was impossible. She couldn't get it up there. She had failed. Just then, a face appeared at the top of the shaft. Sheriff Brody, his face etched with worry. "Sharma, I heard shots. What's going on?" "Caldwell's down," she yelled, her voice hoarse. "But I can't get the server up." Brody disappeared for a moment, then returned with a length of thick rope from his truck. "Tie it on," he shouted. "We'll haul it up." With her one good arm, Anya wrestled the heavy rope around the server rack, securing it with a series of knots her father had taught her for hauling engine blocks. "It's set," she yelled. Up above, Brody and his two young deputies began to pull, their muscles straining. Slowly, painstakingly, the server, the repository of all of Aethelred's sins, began its ascent into the light. Anya leaned against the wall, the adrenaline fading, the pain in her shoulder roaring to life. It was done. She had done it. Below her, Caldwell had fallen silent. The fight was over. As the server cleared the hatch, Anya began the slow, agonizing climb up the ladder, one-handed, into the arms of the law, into the clean air of the home she had just saved. The aftermath was a blur of controlled chaos. As Anya emerged into the daylight, Brody's deputies, their faces pale but resolute, were already securing the perimeter, treating it like the major crime scene it had become. The server sat on the damp forest floor, a strange technological idol in the ancient woods. Brody wrapped a field dressing around Anya's bleeding shoulder, his movements clumsy but gentle. "You're one hell of a soldier, Sharma," he said, his voice thick with a mixture of awe and concern. "But your war is over. Let me fight the rest of this." True to his word, Caldwell's backup arrived. Not a quiet team of mercenaries, but a fleet of black SUVs storming up the logging road, only to be met with the sight of two patrol cars, lights flashing, blocking the way. A man in an expensive suit, flanked by heavily armed security, got out and demanded access, citing corporate property rights. Brody met him at the roadblock, his shotgun held in a casual but firm grip. "This is an active homicide investigation on county land, sir," Brody said, his voice calm and unyielding. "And that," he said, pointing to the server being loaded into an evidence truck, "is evidence. If you have a problem with that, you can take it up with the county prosecutor. Now, I suggest you and your men remove yourselves from my crime scene." The man sputtered, threatened lawsuits, and made frantic calls on his satellite phone. But Brody held his ground. He was just a small-town sheriff, but he was the law here, and for the first time, Aethelred's power had run into a wall it could not break. Federal agencies did eventually arrive, but not the ones Ethelred had in their pocket. Brody, using a secure line, had made a single call to a friend of a friend at the FBI, a man in the environmental crimes unit known for his bulldog tenacity and his distrust of corporate influence. When the FBI landed, it was with their own warrants, and they weren't interested in helping Ethelred. They were there to dismantle it. Anya watched it all from a distance, sitting in the back of an ambulance. She refused to be taken to a hospital, allowing a paramedic to stitch and bandage her shoulder on site. She didn't want to be a part of the circus that was unfolding. Her part was done. As the sun climbed higher, casting dappled light through the canopy, she saw a ghost trotting toward her, his tail held high. He had been by Brody's side the whole time, a silent, steady sentinel. He nudged his head under her good hand, and she buried her fingers in his fur, the simple, honest contact a balm to her weary soul. The news, when it broke, was a firestorm. Aethelred Corporation's stock plummeted. The conspiracy unraveled, taking down corrupt executives and government officials alike. Project Chimera became a byword for corporate evil. The facility was decommissioned, the land placed under federal quarantine for a massive, decades-long cleanup effort. Port Alastair and the entire valley had been saved from a slow, invisible poisoning. But Anya Sharma's name was never mentioned in the news reports. She was an anonymous source, a ghost in the machine of the story. That was her one condition, a condition Sheriff Brody honored without question. He knew she hadn't done it for fame or recognition. She had done it for peace. Her life did not return to what it was. The absolute solitude was gone, replaced by a new, tentative connection to the world. Doc Emmeline started dropping off fresh-baked bread on her porch once a week. Sheriff Brody would stop by every now and then, not to check on her, but just to share a cup of coffee and watch the sunset. The people of Port Alastair, though they didn't know the full story, knew she had done something for them. They treated her with a quiet, respectful distance, nodding to her in the street, a silent acknowledgement of a debt they couldn't name. The wound in her shoulder healed, leaving a clean, pale scar. The wounds inside her, the ones she had carried back from the desert, also began to change. They hadn't disappeared, but they no longer defined her. They were a part of her history, like the scar on her shoulder, a reminder of battles fought and survived. The humming under her land was gone. The silence that returned was different. It was not the empty silence of isolation, but the full, rich silence of true peace. A peace that had been earned. One crisp autumn morning, months later, Anya stood on her porch, a mug of coffee in her hand. Ghost lay at her feet, his head on his paws, his breathing a soft, rhythmic sigh. The forest was a riot of gold and crimson, the air clean and sharp. She looked out over her land, her fortress, her sanctuary. She had come here seeking to escape a war, only to find one waiting for her. But in fighting it, she had found something she hadn't even known she was looking for, a purpose, a community, a home worth defending. She had faced the ghosts of her past and the demons of her present and had emerged, not unscathed, but whole. The dawn broke over the mountains, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold. It was a new day, a quiet day, and for the first time in a very long time, Anya Sharma knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she was finally, truly, home. The quiet strength of one person, standing for what is right, can change the world. If these stories of courage and loyalty resonate with you, consider joining our community, where we honor the silent heroes who walk among us every day.